To answer the following questions, we'll have to use the information that we're given in the question, which is when physical capital per worker rises by 1%, then we know that output per worker rises by 0.6%. So in part A, we have physical capital per worker rising by 5%, which means your output per worker will rise by 5 times the 0.6%. Which means it'll rise by 3%. In part B, we're given that the output per worker increased by 4.8%. So in this case, we can divide the 4.8% by 0.6% to figure out by what percentage points physical capital per worker rose. And here we can see that physical capital per worker rose by 8%. In part C, we have physical capital increasing by 5% and the number of workers falling by 2%. In other words, the change in physical capital is 5%, while the change in the number of workers is negative 2%. Now, from this, we can figure out the change in the physical capital per worker using the hint that's given. Percentage change in the physical capital per worker is the percentage change in physical capital minus the percentage change in the number of workers. Our physical capital rose by 5%. Our number of workers changed by negative 2%, which means our physical capital per worker rose by 7%. Now the question is, in this case, how much would output per worker increase? We know that for each percentage point of increase that we see in the physical capital per worker, output per worker rises by 0.6%. So it's just 7 times that. So it's 7 times the 0.6%, which is 4.2%. In D, we have output per worker rising by 7% and the number of workers rising by 1%. If the question is asking for physical capital per worker, then we don't need the information on the number of workers. We just need to divide the output per worker, 7%, by the 0.6%. We know that physical capital per worker rose by roughly 11.67%. Now, if the question was asking for the amount of increase or amount of change in physical capital, then we can just use the equation that's given in the hint, because we know that the change in the physical capital in terms of percentages would be just the physical capital per worker change plus the number of workers. So our percentage change in physical capital per worker is 11.67%. The number of workers increased by 1%, which means your physical capital rose by 12.67%.